My name is Michael Goldman. I teach sociology and global studies at the University of Minnesota, and I'm writing a book on, where am I? It's, ostensibly it's about this compulsion that countries have to turn cities into global cities. And my focus is on the city of Bangalore in southern India, and I started doing research there around the financial crisis, living there, not realize, and realizing the confusion around how do you build a global city when there's no capital, right? And that's exactly what was the discourse, especially in the United States, if you remember in 2008, that we were capital scarce, which is why we had to bail out the banks because the economy would collapse, right? Remember that? Well, when I went to India, what was so amazing is that those very same financial institutions that were being bailed out by the United States were flush with money, setting up these huge multi-billion-dollar urban infrastructure funds to finance large world-class infrastructure. So, if there was lesson number one, and so I was really interested in on the ground trying to understand how does a small city turn itself into, and the discourse, of course, is that you need world-class infrastructure to attract capital, then attract the rich, and then investors, entrepreneurs, blah blah blah, right? But what was clear at the time was, and it was unambiguously clear, is that because of neoliberalism, and I'll explain in a second, is that cities didn't have money to build world-class infrastructure, right? And so this is where our lessons on liberalization, which in India started in the 1990s, are really important, because one of the key political moves, which was sold by by the U.S., but the World Bank and so many others, is that central government should not be giving money to cities to invest in infrastructure. That in fact, what's more efficient is to go to the market, right? Because the market is competitive and is a free market. So the idea is, so at the time, liberalization was fundamentally in many countries in the world, including in the U.S., was that cities then had to become actors in the global market and had to borrow in order to fund infrastructure. So what led me to this topic was that I realized that, well, if I was to understand why it is that the world-class infrastructure in India was never being completed, and that there was a mass amount of displacement in order to create the space for infrastructure, that it seemed like developers were building, but they weren't finishing, that perhaps what I need to understand, if the world-class infrastructure was the foundation for transformation in the global south, development, to create a globally competitive city, then I need to understand better the foundation on which that foundation was being built, which was finance capital. So that's how I was brought to that, and I'm going to try to consciously think about the activists in all of you, and to try to suggest that sometimes when we look at housing, or when we look at highways, or when we look at parking meters, or we look at schools, we tend to think that these are fixed capital assets that stay in the community. And I'm going to suggest that we need to release ourselves of what we call methodological nationalism, which is to tend to think that what's happening in our borders can be explained necessarily locally or regionally. And instead to try to realize, just as we're talking about transnational solidarities, is that finance capital only succeeds because it's able to remain liquid and travel across borders, okay? So the ultimate question is, how does that affect governance? It's important to appreciate that this is recent phenomenon. The story I'm about to tell, of course, and I'm just going to be really crude and move quickly here, so you can challenge me on the recentness of this. Because of course, the railroads in India, which are fixed capital, were actually all along, the discourse in the mid-1800s was that this was a way in which to integrate India into the global economy, build railroads, grow cotton, send it out. But actually, if you look carefully, you realize that the railroads were built by insurance companies and by banks in England, and the only way that they were allowed The only way that they could be convinced to invest in railways in the 1800s in India was to get a guaranteed rate of profit rate of return by the British state, and all the losses were incurred by the Indian government. We realize that there is a longer history to the way in which we think that when railways are to benefit the local community and spur the local economy, when we realize historically that those were built by finance capital. And where did they get their investment money? From the same people that invested in slave ships, right? So we know that from the get-go, finance capital is transnational, but politically we forget that. And so I'm trying to highlight that. And so, you know, there was a global urban turn in the World Bank, where in the 1970s, Robert McNamara, you know, who led the Vietnam War, wanted on a war path to try to solve the poverty problem, i.e., you know, rural insurrections. And tried to create a Department of you know, Urban Development, and economists thought that was absurd. Why? Because what in the city can you invest in? You know, these are poor people, poor citizens. And it actually, the World Bank never invested in urban infrastructure until the 1990s. And now, the head of UN Habitat made this declaration at a meeting I went to in Barcelona, and he said, we will build more urban infrastructure in the next 30 years than in all of human history. You know? And when he said, and he's head of UN Habitat, which is about building housing for the poor, right? And most of India lives in villages, right? In the rural, in the towns. So he said he's been confronted by rural ministers who say all the time, why don't you build housing in the countryside where most people live? And he said, how will you pay it back? So, you know, it's sometimes listening to capitalists is the most insightful way of understanding how capital works. So where does the finance come from? So just skimming over a lot, is in the last 3 years, so since 2010, the Indian economy has been highly volatile, no matter what the US press says. And a lot of it, land prices skyrocket, but housing has been highly volatile, including office spaces. Since 2010, there's been a surfeit of empty office buildings. And I talk to real estate developers in India, and they can make a profit by just selling 40% of the units, residential units in their new buildings. Because they told me, quite frankly, they use the same raw material, the cost of raw material is the same where they build affordable housing, where they build luxury housing, which is interesting. And so all the profit is just selling a fraction of the units in the building, most of which are empty. If you go to the outskirts of Bangalore, Delhi, or Bombay at night, you'll see that most of these 24-story towers, there are no lights on. So what we learn is, and I'm going to bring it to Chicago in a second, is that most of the housing, in terms from the perspective of capital investment, is at the level of speculation. Okay, so that's one story, and and then there's another level too. So on this level, that is that you know, after the financial crisis and Blackstone was broke, right, because it lost all its money, it's investing hugely in Asia and in Europe and in the United States, and what they're investing in is housing. So in my city, Minneapolis, they're the largest, since 2014, they're the largest homeowner. In terms of office space, they bought pennies to the dollar, 30 million square feet, which is, I can't remember, but it's you know, like the size of Manhattan or something, and for $3 billion, and it has been anticipated that within, it says 5 years, but in 10 years, they'll make that back into terms of $20 billion. And the key point here is that they're not making that profit off rents. Yes, but the key feature is when they become the largest office space owner in India, which they have in 3 years. So we're talking about different actors than in the past. Or in Chicago, or Miami, or Atlanta, or in what you just said in the Bay Area, but also in Minneapolis, they become the largest landowners. They're not making their profit from rents alone, primarily, okay? But what they are doing, and this is a key point because I started with the idea that cities should be competing against each other on the capital markets, is that the assumption is that that's when you get more efficient access to capital and then it's cheaper. that actually what we find out is that there are only a handful, 3 or 4 or 5 companies around the world that are doing this. That is, it's a monopoly. It's an attempt to monopolize office and housing markets in different countries, which means that and this is one of the key points. 2 key points is that they don't profit. Capital doesn't profit, doesn't create. How do I say this? Is that crisis is an opportunity, and from that opportunity, it creates markets. So if you can think about 2008 as a moment of foreclosure, cheap houses on the market, that's precisely a market that they created. And it's at that point they could monopolize that market, and it's the series of markets that they create that I'm trying to emphasize. So here, the reason why they can make $20 billion in 5 to 10 years is because Deutsche Bank and others are creating a market of rental securitization bonds. So if you remember back in the old days, mortgages is what brought the economy down in the US, so the dominant discourse was. That is, Latinos in California were buying houses when they couldn't afford it. But in fact, that was a $70 trillion market, mortgages. But the derivatives and hedge market globally was $700 trillion. So the question we need to understand is not so much what's happening, I mean, of course we do in terms of organizing, what happens to fixed capital, the housing market, but also we have to understand the actions of why people are buying and selling en masse these houses is because the way in which it becomes securitized. And where's my slide? I'm sorry. And so these are kind of my basic, if you will, findings and others around what we could call financializing the city. And I'll give you a couple more examples before I run out of time. So it's not that they're investing in IT or they're investing in downtown Chicago, or they're investing in certain sites, or through tax incremental financing, reinvigorating, resegregating, whatever words you want to use. That's not the innovation. The innovation is the way in which they can create markets out of crisis, and they monopolize those markets along a value and decision-making chain crossing national boundaries. So that's why I brought up the beginning where capital was scarce in the US, but through those same firms, it was flushed in another part of the world. If you think about what happened in the financial crisis throughout Europe, the European Central Bank was desperate to bail out Spanish banks because they all crashed after they over-speculated on real estate, real estate, toll roads, stadiums, and what have you. And those banks were bailed out with European Central Bank money, but with no strings attached. And where do you think that new capital went? To small towns in Spain, or to resurrect the housing mortgage? No, it pivoted towards Latin America. And it invested in a World Cup and Olympics infrastructure, which now the Brazilian government is paying billions of dollars, based on a kind of racialized displacement, which became necessary in order to build that kind of infrastructure. And our comrades from South Africa know the story from the earlier World Cup. And if you look, so after a crisis, they buy pennies to the dollar, toll roads, stadiums. In Chicago, there's 30,000 parking meters, as well as the Chicago Skyway. Most of the toll roads around Chicago, of course, are owned by private equity firms, right? And they're called cash cows. So they're a way in which you can get weekly, daily, hourly cash flows. But it's not. But it's that money that they're able to buy. But if you look buy infrastructure around the world at pennies to the dollar after a crisis. But what's really important to appreciate is that those toll roads, like the Chicago Skyway, also go bankrupt. But if you look carefully at the way in which the contract is negotiated, is Macquarie, which owns the Chicago Skyway, put very little capital of its own in. And that's key. That is that they're not investing their money in these projects that eventually crash. They're investing our pension funds, among other things. And they're investing the commitment that Mayor Daley, with J.P. Morgan, which was his brother, right, at J.P. Morgan, when he sold the parking meters, a guarantee that for $2 billion, I can't remember quite the numbers, but it was something like $2 billion up front so Chicago could pay its bills. They would get a 75-year lease on all the parking meters. which in the next 5 years they'll pay off that $2 billion of those parking meters. In the next 50 years, it's just a pure cash flow, which enables them to buy depressed assets, including housing in India. So the change in so what can be called a global hub and spoke system is that the housing project in your community or that infrastructure in your town is actually not owned by any company, particularly locally, but it's owned by private equity firms. The parking meters are owned by a consortium that was invented over a weekend with Sovereign Wealth Fund from UAE, JP Morgan, and a teacher's pension fund. So, think about the politics of labor for a second, when labor's retirements are dependent upon this kind of gross speculation and displacement. And part of if we wanted to get into kind of theory of labor, what does it mean when today 50% of the U.S. economy profits are coming from finance? And when you look at not manufacturing or services, and remember in the 1950s it was just like 3%. So there has been a change over time. But in India, if you look at foreign capital investment, and all the press is hyperventilating about all the foreign capital that comes to a place like India, Brazil, what have you, is that practically none of it goes into manufacturing. Most of it goes into real estate, goes into finance. 40% of the Bombay stock market is owned by invested by a handful of private equity firms, Wall Street firms. So when we look at the stock market as like the people's market, we have to appreciate that it only works when it becomes monopolized, okay? And so then the question is around governance, right? So if governance over public goods and resources and urban infrastructure, let's say the case of Chicago, Cape Town, by the way, the toll roads in and out of Cape Town all the way to Mozambique are 1,300 square kilometers of it are owned by private equity firms. So it's not just local. Is that most of these agreements are defined by contracts, and contracts by definition in capitalist society are proprietary, which means that we can't see what's in the contract. So we have no idea, unless you surround the mayor, what is in the contract. But when we think about politics, how do we control the rates, the fees, when cities are in debt and dependent upon this kind of borrowed capital, which they use public space and public goods as collateral for? Just to highlight in the U.S. How since the 1970s, most of the corporate profits are in the finance sector. So when we think about, why are we talking about jobs? And when capital is not investing in jobs, wages, obviously. It's global, right? And as is protest. So the question is, how do we kind of this magical world of finance, which the press and so many people are in love with, that is, it doesn't matter that your wages will be low when you graduate from UIUC if you can invest strategically in the market, right? Wages haven't gone up in this country since the 70s and 80s, but that's also true in Spain, and that's also true in India. So in the case of India, I have 2 minutes? In the case of India, the same thing is true. The idea was to build an airport outside of Bangalore, 30 kilometers away, and sweep up all the land in between, which is farmland, which is pasture land, which is commons, which is the watershed for the city of Bangalore, and build on speculation housing. And as a consequence, whole villages were forcibly displaced because, of course, part of the other liberalization process is to devalue the rural, right? Because food production produces in rupees, what? But real estate production produces in dollars, right? The fact that nobody locally owns that property is a different question. So what's interesting about, important politically about this story is that first of all, a lot of this is recent. In the case of India, only up until 2005, foreign companies couldn't buy land in India. Since 2005, the price of land has skyrocketed, even as price of housing is highly volatile. And during those volatility moments is precisely when Blackstone buys. Okay? And the second step, which I just want to highlight again, is remember, is that it's not that fixed asset where they make the profit. It's the process of displacement that the government offers cheap land to companies like Blackstone and others, I'm just naming one, in order for them to come. So displacement, racialized displacement is the first step the government offers, special economic zones, tax-free zones, to invest in real estate, because real estate is so much more profitable than manufacturing. And as a consequence, the only people who can afford to buy this are not even individual investors, but REITs, real estate investment trusts, which means that anybody who's lucky enough to have a pension is investing in these projects which require displacement in order to attract. And so when I did my research around the airport in Bangalore, these women, the Dalits, were part of where the runway is. So they call the runway of the airport as the graveyard for Dalits. Tens of thousands of people were forcibly displaced. She was given this plot of land. But because there was no land to do agriculture, she sold it to a Bangalore speculator. That is, knowing that these tiny villages were going to disappear in a matter of time. So where's Tony? This is the process of displacement. And realized, so she ended up, and as all the other families, they lived in the cowshed. And they sold for pennies to the dollar their house. In the way in which the way we focus on the city, and I'm sorry to show pictures like this, but this was part of a farmers movement a couple months ago in Delhi, when farmer suicides around Bangalore is the largest, highest rates in the country. Even though we think about IT, and it's important to remember where the land comes from, and the land comes from farmers, right? And among others. And this just highlights how distressed the rural is. 70% of the Indian population and then of the world, because of this idea of global urbanism, that we have to invest in our cities. Eating live rats, many marched around naked. And why? Not only were they so, damn humiliated by the kind of economic situation they lived in, but they were trying to, tap into the humiliation of their political leaders. And the political leaders kept running after them and said, we'll give you what you want. Because these are the kind of pictures that sort of undermine the magic of the market that seems to be the attraction in India. And I highlight these pictures, well, those are evictions, okay, I don't even get to those, to highlight the fact that, politically, how do you capture finance capital, right? They're nowhere. And so, we have to think about the fact that they actually, when markets crash, if there's a housing movement in Chicago, if they demand for rent control, that's precisely, a intervention into that market, right? Blackstone's not going to invest there. So we have to figure out ways in which to create this kind of transnational solidarities to actually, successfully, like the movements in Spain, to take to the streets to occupy the streets to say our public space is not for sale, which is precisely what's happening in sporadic forms throughout parts of the world, India, China, and Brazil. But there's a way in which the luxury of organizers in the United States, if you will, need to be conscious of the ways in which we need to develop these solidarities. And that is to humiliate Blackstone, to figure out how to control, how to regulate the market, which, remember, was regulated not so long ago. This sounds like there's got to be an intervention by people in order to understand that this is a life and death kind of issue. And we're all complicit in the way in which this kind of speculative governmentality forces us, particularly folks with low wage, to invest in the market as their only way in order to stay in the city.